The world the Parthians were born into was already scarred by conquest. Centuries of empire had washed over the lands of Persia. First the Achaemenids, then Alexander the Great, and finally the Seleucids, the Macedonian kings who inherited his shattered dominion. But in the far northeast, beyond the great cities, beyond the neat order of Greek-style kingdoms, lay a harsher world, windswept plains, mountains, and desert. It was here that the Parthians first emerged. Their beginnings were not grand. They were not born in palaces or wealthy cities, but in the rugged steppe, among a people known as the Parni. The Parni were one of many nomadic tribes roaming the fringes of Central Asia, horsemen who lived by the bow and the herd. To the Greeks who ruled Persia, they were little more than barbarians at the edge of the world. Yet in time, these very nomads would seize the crown of kings. Their story begins with a man named Arsaces. Around 247 BC, while the Seleucid Empire still looked strong on the map, Arsaces and his brother Tiridates led their Parni warriors into the region of Parthia, a rugged province in northeastern Iran. The Seleucid satrap who ruled it was defeated, and the Parni seized the land. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a minor rebellion in a distant corner of the empire. The Seleucids had greater concerns in the west, where rival kings and generals challenged their rule. But this small foothold became the seed of something far larger. For the people of Parthia, the rise of Arsaces was more than conquest, it was liberation. He presented himself not only as a tribal leader, but as a king in the Persian tradition. He took on the ancient Achaemenid title of King of Kings, styling himself as the heir to Persia's great dynasties, while still retaining the fierce warrior traditions of the steppe. It was a clever balance, nomadic strength fused with Persian legitimacy. Over time, the dynasty founded by Arsaces, known as the Arsacids, expanded their domain. Step by step, province by province, they chipped away at Seleucid control. The Seleucids, weakened by constant wars in Greece and the Near East, struggled to respond. By the late 2nd century BC, the Parthians had grown from an upstart tribe into the rulers of an empire stretching from the Euphrates River to the mountains of Central Asia. But their rise was not just a matter of conquest. Geography itself worked in their favor. Their homelands lay along the vital arteries of the Silk Road, the great trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with China. From this position, the Parthians could control the flow of silk, spices, and precious goods, enriching themselves and strengthening their hold over Persia. What made their empire so unusual was its character. Unlike the rigidly centralized states of the past, the Parthians ruled more loosely. Their kingdom was less an empire of provinces and more a confederation of powerful noble families, each loyal to the Arsacid throne, but fiercely independent. This system gave the Parthians resilience. Even when one part of the empire was under attack, the others could hold firm. But it also planted the seeds of future instability. Still, in these early centuries, the Parthians thrived. They had transformed from an obscure steppe tribe into heirs of Persia, guardians of the East, and the rising power of the ancient world. And soon, they would clash with the greatest empire of the West, Rome. To understand the Parthians, one must look beyond the battlefield. Their empire was not built like those of the Greeks or the Romans. It was something different, something born from the rhythms of nomadic life, yet rooted in the soil of Persia. At the heart of Parthian society stood the noble houses. These families were vast landowners, warriors, and power brokers, ruling their own territories with considerable independence. They owed allegiance to the Arsacid king, but their loyalty was as much a matter of negotiation as of duty. If the king demanded troops, the nobles provided them. If he demanded taxes, they delivered wealth. but in return, the king was expected to respect their power. This balance created a system where no single ruler could dominate absolutely, yet no noble could easily break away. It was a delicate arrangement, and for centuries it held. For the common people, life under the Parthians was a blend of continuity and change. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, farmers worked the same fields their ancestors had cultivated under the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians. They grew barley, wheat, and dates, feeding not only the empire, but also the caravans that crossed its roads. In the cities, merchants thrived. The Parthians controlled the heart of the Silk Road, and they taxed it wisely. From the east came silk, jade, and spices. From the west came glassware, silver, and wine. The empire's wealth poured into its markets, and Parthian cities became bustling hubs of trade. Culturally, the Parthians stood at a crossroads. They inherited the traditions of ancient Persia, but they did not erase the Greek influences left by Alexander's conquest. Their coins often bore Greek inscriptions, and their cities sometimes followed Hellenistic designs. Yet, at the same time, they revived Iranian customs. The Parthian kings emphasized their connection to Zoroastrian traditions, honoring the old fire temples and the ancient gods of Persia. In their art, one can see both worlds: Greek naturalism fused with the bold, frontal style that would later shape Persian and even Byzantine iconography. But perhaps nothing defined the Parthians more than their horses. They were, at their core, a people of the steppe. Horsemanship was in their blood. The Parthian cavalry was legendary, feared across the ancient world. Their warriors perfected a deadly tactic that became synonymous with their name: the Parthian shot. In battle, mounted archers would ride swiftly past their enemy, feigning retreat. Then, twisting in the saddle, they would loose volleys of arrows backward with deadly precision, breaking the enemy's pursuit. It was a tactic born of the steppe, but refined into an art under the Parthians. The image of a Parthian warrior, bow drawn, eyes fixed on the enemy while galloping at full speed, became the very symbol of their empire. These tactics allowed them to stand toe-to-toe with Rome, the most disciplined military machine of the age. Where Rome relied on heavy infantry, the Parthians countered with mobility, precision, and patience. Yet life was not all war and politics. In the courts of the Parthian kings, splendor rivaled anything in the Mediterranean. Banquets filled with music, wine, and rich foods celebrated victories and cemented alliances. In the countryside, festivals tied to the agricultural calendar brought communities together, blending Zoroastrian rituals with local traditions. The Parthians were not isolationists, they were connectors, bringing together cultures from the edges of the known world. By the 1st century BC, the Parthians were more than just rulers of Persia. They were gatekeepers of the East, controlling trade, culture, and the flow of power between worlds. But with such power came inevitable conflict, and soon their empire would be tested by the greatest rival they would ever face: Rome. The Parthians may have been heirs of Persia, but history rarely allows empires to exist in peace. By the 1st century BC, a new force had risen to dominate the Mediterranean world: the Roman Republic. Its legions were unmatched in discipline and conquest. Yet when Rome looked eastward, it found the Parthians standing directly in their path. The two worlds could not have been more different. Rome thrived on the power of heavy infantry, drilling its soldiers into near-mechanical discipline. The Parthians relied on cavalry, mobility, and the endless space of the steppe. One empire was built on order and cities, the other on speed and freedom. It was inevitable that they would collide. The first great test came in 53 BC, in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men and a member of the famous First Triumvirate, marched east with 7 legions. His dream was to conquer Parthia, to add another jewel to Rome's crown and match the military glories of Caesar and Pompey. But his ambition would prove fatal. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians unleashed the full fury of their cavalry. With perhaps only 10,000 horsemen, they faced nearly 40,000 Romans. Yet their tactics turned the battlefield into a nightmare for the legions. Parthian horse archers swarmed the Romans, showering them with arrows, always staying just out of reach. And when Roman cavalry tried to chase them down, they were met with heavily armored cataphracts, the shock cavalry of the Parthians, thundering across the plain in gleaming armor. Then came the legendary Parthian shot. The Romans believed their enemy was retreating, only to find arrows raining down on them as the Parthians twisted in their saddles to fire backward. Hour after hour, the Romans bled under the sun, unable to break their enemy. When Crassus tried to negotiate, he was killed, and thousands of Romans were captured or slain. The victory at Carrhae was not just a triumph, it was a statement. The Parthians had humbled the might of Rome. For decades afterward, the frontier between the two powers became a constant battleground. Armenia, caught between the two empires, changed hands again and again. Roman emperors dreamed of conquering Parthia, while Parthian kings sought to protect their borders and influence the politics of the region. Cities like Seleucia and Ctesiphon were besieged, taken, and retaken, but the balance of power never tipped decisively. What made the Parthians so resilient against Rome was not just their tactics, but their style of warfare itself. Rome was used to fighting enemies who stood and fought: Gauls, Carthaginians, Greeks. Against the Parthians, the legions often marched into emptiness. Entire armies disappeared into the desert, supplies ran low, and then suddenly, the Parthians struck. It was a different kind of war, one Rome never fully mastered. Yet the Parthians too had limits. Their political system, with powerful nobles and semi-independent rulers, meant that unity was never guaranteed. While they could defeat Rome in pitched battles, they often struggled to follow up with large-scale conquests. Their strength lay in defense, in holding the line against Rome rather than pressing into the Mediterranean world. Still, for centuries, the Parthians stood as the only true rival Rome could not crush. In the eyes of the ancient world, this was a remarkable achievement. They were proof that Rome was not invincible. But history is never static. The Parthians had carved out an empire and defended it against one of the most relentless powers of all time. Yet the seeds of change were already growing within their realm. And as new enemies emerged, the cracks in Parthian unity would begin to show. For centuries, the Parthians had stood firm against Rome, defying the ambitions of emperors and holding their place as masters of Persia. But no empire lasts forever. By the 2nd century AD, the cracks within Parthia began to widen. Their strength had always been their cavalry and their aristocracy, but this was also their greatest weakness. Power was decentralized. Great noble families, called the 7 Houses of Parthia, controlled vast estates, armies, and wealth. The Arsacid kings depended on them, but when these nobles withdrew their loyalty or competed among themselves, the empire faltered. Civil wars became more frequent, with rival claimants to the throne backed by different noble factions. Rome, always watching, seized on these divisions. Emperors like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius launched campaigns deep into Parthian territory. In 116 AD, Trajan marched to Mesopotamia and briefly captured the Parthian capital, Ctesiphon. For a moment, it seemed Parthia might collapse entirely. But holding the land proved too difficult for Rome, and soon they withdrew. Even so, the balance of power had shifted. The Parthians were no longer the unstoppable horsemen of Kari. Meanwhile, new challenges rose within the empire itself. In the region of Persis, modern-day Fars in southern Iran, a local dynasty known as the Sassanids gained strength. Led by Ardashir I, they challenged the Arsacids directly, rallying Persians under the banner of restoring the glory of the old Achaemenid kings. Unlike the Parthians, the Sassanids built a far more centralized state, with firm control over both nobility and military. By the early 3rd century, the Sassanid revolt erupted into open war. In 224 AD, at the Battle of Hormozgan, Ardashir defeated the last Arsacid king, Artabanus IV. With that, the Parthian dynasty came to an end. After nearly 500 years of rule, the Arsacid line had fallen, replaced by the Sasanian Empire, which would go on to dominate Persia for centuries and become one of Rome's greatest enemies. Yet the legacy of the Parthians was not erased. They had preserved Persia's independence during a time when Rome seemed unstoppable. They had introduced a style of warfare that reshaped how empires thought about cavalry and mobility. The image of the horse archer and the armored cataphract would echo far into the medieval world. Even more, they had left behind a cultural blend, Greek influence from Alexander's conquests mixed with Iranian traditions. Their capital cities, their coins, and their art all reflected a crossroads of civilizations, a reminder of how Persia stood between East and West. When historians look back, the Parthians often stand in the shadow of the Achaemenids before them and the Sassanids after them. But they were more than a bridge between dynasties. They were survivors, warriors, and rulers who carved out their place against impossible odds. And in doing so, they wrote one of the most fascinating chapters in the long history of Persia.